All right, so this is going to be the little intro video for our next and final unit, which is the novel Brave New World. This is probably my favorite book to teach all year round, so I'm pretty sad that we're going to have to clip our understandings of it this year. So, just to give you a quick background, with this book, my plan is to assign reading to you every Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. We'll start with today, and we will be finished with the book by May 15th, and just kind of giving you an overview of kind of what the expectation will be. You guys worked really hard during our serial podcast unit, and I was really impressed with how you stayed on top of listening to things and doing assignments. So, my view for this unit is pretty much that the majority of the work that you'll need to do is just to read the book. And if you're really over reading right now and you don't want to read, one lucky thing for us is that this book has an excellent audiobook that goes along with it. And while some of you, if you're getting two chapters assigned a day for me that you need to get through, if you're a quick reader, you'll kind of fly through this. If not, and you're going to listen to it, you might get intimidated seeing that, chapter one takes 25 minutes. But you guys know that to adjust the settings and the playback speed, you can easily, once you get the gist of what's going on in the book, you can bump that up so that it's not taking you the full time. So, this is a book really in particular that I encourage you to read it because it's great. But if you'd rather listen to it, this audiobook, I mean, it has sound effects, they do voices, it's awesome. Um, so we're going to be back on our own Google Classroom page now, kind of away from the serial podcast page. The last thing I'm looking on there for is obviously just your essays. So I'm going to post a reading schedule this morning along with kind of the opening for this assignment. In addition to doing some reading, I'm also going to have 2 days where you guys are going to hop on a Google Meet with me and we're going to do a class discussion. With these discussions, part of it is just so I can talk you through because this book is a little bit different, but it's also just a chance two more times for you guys to be together as a group. Um, Usually I do a presentation, and I thought long and hard about whether or not I would have you guys actually do like a Screencastify presentation, but because you did such a nice job on um, the last unit, you're only going to have one project for this. So there will be no test, there will be no paper. Really, there's no writing assignments left aside from your final project, which you'll get this posted later on today. And it's something that you can work on throughout reading this book. So we're going to go back to this idea of the hero's journey. We always end the year with the hero's journey with this book. And I have a pre made Google slide presentation that you are going to use as your final assignment. This is going to be a solid 100 points in the grade book. So if you are feeling like, okay, that paper maybe I don't know how I did on it, but I know that I can, I'd love another 100 points. Well, this is going to be your in progress assignment for this book. Essentially, you're going to choose one of the main characters and you're going to go through this little presentation I've made and you're going to follow along with the hero's journey and you're going to analyze the journey of one of those characters throughout the book. So, each of the steps along the way, which there's not too many, don't worry, you are going to fill in a description. What was this person like before their call to adventure? How do you know? Well, you would just say, because this was what they were like at the beginning of the book. And then you're going to pick out a quick quote that you can put on there to kind of support this, right? So if it was before the call to adventure and you picked Bernard Marx, you might choose one of the first quotes we see in the book about him. So you're just going to follow through, and each of the stages has its own little spot for you to type in. This does not have to be in complete sentences. This can be, a couple words for the description application, the quote. The only thing I'm going to need from you is a page number. So that's how we're going to do this final unit. 2 discussions and a project. Daily, when you check in to see what the reading assignments are, there might be a question posted for you. This is nothing where I'm expecting anything longer than a few words or at most one sentence. So it might be, what's a question you have during this unit, or it might be, what's the name of the new female character we met in chapter 2. So really easy stuff just to kind of keep us all together. Um, Okay, so I wanted to give you guys a brief introduction to the beginning of this book because it is a little bit different. Usually, we would spend a couple days in class talking about this, but like right now, we don't have that luxury with the amount of time that we've got left. So, if you finished the web quest, you found out a little bit of information on the author Aldous Huxley, which hopefully that can give you an understanding of, as you start to read this, how he came up with some of these crazy things. So he was a very scientific minded guy. The fact that he almost went blind prohibited him from working in science, but that didn't stop his love for it. So this book, Brave New World, is classified as science fiction. In addition, this is also a book that I tried to prep you for. It is one of the most frequently banned or challenged books because of the things that show up in the book. It's been cited for everything from racism, sexuality, drug use, derogatory language, improper, description of Native Americans. So putting that all out there, just so you guys kind of know ahead of time what you're getting into. Now, the title I had you guys look into right at the beginning by going to Shakespeare's play The Tempest. We'll kind of get into that later. You guys will start to understand it, but just kind of note that the title does come from Shakespeare, Brave New World. Aside from that, I had you guys look into a couple different things that dealt with psychology. So, these ideas from Pavlov, who was the guy that worked with the dogs and their whole idea of digestion and classical conditioning, John Watson, who kind of studied association with the little boy Albert B and how he was shown the mouse but also a loud noise and learned to hate the mouse. And then B.F. Skinner, who developed ideas of how to shape behavior based on a reward system. So these are important if you were kind of just scratching your head, like, why is she making me read this? Just to kind of understand how this society has been made, how the people in this book that we're going to start reading, why they act the way that they do. And then the final part of that web quest that was important for you to look at was Henry Ford. Now, we all know Henry Ford as kind of the guy who, Ford, the Model T, the first automobile. But aside from just making the first automobile, he was known kind of as the father of the middle class. He created a middle class in America based on his business philosophy. Um, he was the man that pioneered the assembly line and that technology that really helped to industrialize um, and urbanize our country. But also, a side that a lot of people don't know about him is more of how he treated his workers, not just on their time when they were at work, but in the communities that he had them living in. He had this almost secret police that liked to monitor to make sure that they were acting what was considered socially acceptable. He had a sociological department that would randomly show up at their house and make sure that the workers weren't overdoing it on drinking, or they weren't gambling too much, or if it was a Sunday that they were at church and not at the local pub. So kind of a guy that had a lot of control over not only the working lives of his workers, but also the home lives. So all of this is going to come together and hopefully be apparent as to why this little bit of background helped you out. But I will say, in kind of starting Brave New World and our discussion of it, one thing that's important to note is that Aldous Huxley, this was a social criticism when he wrote it. So this book is not meant to be something that is dark in terms of, if any of you've read like 1984, that's a really dark kind of dooming feeling. This book is socially criticizing a lot of different facets of society, but it's doing so in a way that's ironic and satirical. So it's almost funny sometimes, the way that he's looking at the world. So what I just have here as a social criticism, he wrote this book as the world was recovering from World War One. So no idea that World War Two was on the horizon, and a lot of the totalitarian governments that rose up during World War Two. So Hitler had not risen to power yet. The Soviet Union was not yet or had just started rising to a totalitarian state. Fascism was spreading through Europe. So as he was seeing these things happen, kind of the setup for World War II, he had a lot of these political feelings. And so he decided to put those influences into his first full length book, which is Brave New World. His ultimate criticisms that we're going to see in this book are that we have a consumer driven culture In other words, he went on a visit to America once. If you read through his little biography, and he was amazed by how people had this really like high Hollywood, like joyous type of life, but he thought that a lot of that was because of our consumption and not based on like innate internal facets of happiness, but consumer driven. um, he also was criticizing the power that totalitarian governments had. So at this point, Hitler hadn't risen to power, and he didn't see what governments with total control totally could do. Um, but he still had a criticism of what he was seeing, in the Soviet Union. And then finally, this was a criticism of the dangers of allowing technology and progress to go on unchecked by anybody. So, what happens when you just let progress and technology go, 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 and you never question it or stop? All right. So, the beginning of the book is an epigraph, which is just how we started Fahrenheit 451 when we did that fun little writing exercise. But I wanted to just let you know that the epigraph is actually a translation from French and what this French translation ultimately means. So, if you turn to the first page in your book, if you have a hard copy, or the beginning of the PDF, you'll see this epigraph by a guy named Nicholas Berdyaev. And you probably, unless you speak French, which would be amazing, have no idea what it means. So, this is what the translation means: Utopias seem to be much more realizable than we formerly believed them to be. Now we find ourselves presented with another alarming question: how do we prevent their definitive realization? Utopias are realizable. Life marches towards utopias. Perhaps a new century will begin, a century in which intellectuals and the cultivated class will dream of ways to evict utopias and return to a non utopic society, less perfect and more free. So, this idea of a utopia is a perfect world. And so, what Huxley has done in Brave New World is he's created a dystopia, which is kind of an imagining of something that is not perfect. Um, this translation ultimately is a caution against seeking out the perfect world. And that might seem ridiculous, especially given what's going on in our world right now, where we've got this rampant disease and sickness, and now it's causing all sorts of unrest with people, protesting about the economy. And so um, there's a lot of things to say that aren't great. And wouldn't it be nice if we could live in a more perfect world? The problem with that, though, is that utopias and dystopias are the same side of the coin. And so, if we continually try to march towards a perfect world, we might be upset or shocked to find out what we might have to give up in order to have that type of happiness. And so, this epigraph, this caution against the perfect world, is how I want you to begin reading this book. So, as this place is described, this place where people live, and Huxley is showing us this new society, remember that he's cautioning against a society that tries to be perfect. All right. So, just a few fun facts that you probably don't care about for utopias, but in case it comes up on trivia, utopia in Greek means no place. All right, some words that are important for you to know just in this first chapter. You can always Google these if it comes up, but I thought that it would be at least worth kind of showing you this. Totalitarian government, for those of you up to this point that have been scratching your head, is just a government where the state holds total control. So, going back to Henry Ford, he might have been considered a totalitarian leader of his company with how he tried to manage all parts of his workers' lives. Viviparous basically just means giving birth, where the young is born inside or is developed inside of a parent's body. So, births, the way that children come into this world now, are viviparous. And the reason that's important is because that is not the case in the book. So, viviparous is going to be used to refer to how we understand children entering the world now. Decanting, for all of my chemistry people, it's just a process for separating mixtures. The first two chapters are highly scientific in their explanation of society. So that's just a word that you might see used. And then predestination means controlling what somebody will be like according to pre selected criteria. So if we lived in a place where there was predestination, it might have been decided when you were born that some of you will be plumbers, some of you will be teachers, some of you will be doctors. But we live in a place where there is no predestination. You can kind of choose the life that you want. All right. So, as you dive into chapter one, whether you listen to it or read it, what's important to remember is that we are being introduced from the very get go to this society. This is set in AF 632, meaning this would be about the year, oh gosh, I read it somewhere, like 2542. So, this is thinking like, a couple hundred years in the future here. Their time markers that they use are after Ford, and you'll see that Henry Ford is kind of the central, he's a central person in this book. And he's not alive anymore, obviously, because it's AF after Ford, but his philosophies are really important. So, in this imagined society, we have a totalitarian state that has robbed humans of free choice and has forced them into happiness with genetics and conditioning. Technology is the empowering force behind maintaining and achieving this state. The book is set in central London. There are no countries anymore, so it's not London, England. There are just world states, and they'll talk about the different world states in the book. And I always like to stop and pause at the first page, or if you're listening, just the beginning, because if you notice the word choice here, a lot of it has to do with things that are cold or dead. So they're presenting the world not as a dystopia, but as a utopia and kind of telling us how they got the world to be perfect. All right, so in chapter one, the building that's being described at first is the Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Center. The director of hatcheries is leading a group of students on a tour of the facilities. They begin in the fertilizing room. So rather than having viviparous births, the people that are alive in this society were all made in a center like this. So at the start of any baby being made, there has to be fertilization. So, in this sense, we have now applied the process of making people to Henry Ford's assembly line. Step one of the assembly line is the fertilization room. So, they surgically remove ovaries from the female, they have them artificially inseminated, and then, depending on how they're going to treat these little embryos, depends on their predestination. So, some embryos are allowed to develop naturally. If we need people that are going to be doctors and political leaders and thinkers in society, well, every society needs them. So, those embryos are going to be treated the best. However, there's also the need for lower level workers, maybe just the people that are going to be picking up trash on the side of the road, or the person that is going to be working in the elevator and their job consists of pushing a button every day. Those people don't necessarily need all of the brain power that doctors and political leaders do. So they're going to be put through a process called the Bakhanovsky process. In this perfect society, because you need people to fill all the roles, the predestination, which the world state determines, is going to put people in one of five selected castes. So if you've seen that word before, it might have been in how it's applied in India. India has three castes as far as a social hierarchy. So in this book, there are five castes. The highest caste is the alpha. These are the strong, physical specimen people, but they're also highly intelligent. Just a step down from alphas, still highly capable, maybe not as physically big and strong, would be the betas. The mid level caste would be the gammas. The deltas, now you start getting into people that have stunted physical growth. They have stunted intellectual capabilities. And then the lowest caste of all is the epsilons. And these people are referred to in the book as epsilon semi-morons. So there's not a lot going on upstairs. And physically, you can see they're a lot smaller than the alphas and betas, who would be of the highest caste. All right, continuing on with chapter one, we are meant to be just like a student on this tour of this hatchery and conditioning center. So once we get out of the fertilization room, we learn about the Bakhanovsky process, which the director says is one of the major instruments of social stability. So the lower caste embryos, so these would be the embryos like the deltas and the epsilons, they go through a process of egg division that basically creates identical twins. So if you have one embryo and maybe you zap it, it'll cause the embryo to split, and now where you had just one, there are now two people. However, in the Bakhanovsky's process, they do things to this one embryo that cause it to divide so many times that you might get from one single embryo 500 different children. Now, that might seem like a really good idea. We can populate a whole factory with one embryo. However, there are certain things lost through the process of division here, right? Brain power, physical stature. So the things that they're talking about are all made up here. Bakunovsky's process and Podstap's technique. These are scientific processes that they're basically describing as to how they get the most efficiency from each embryo. And if you Google or put into YouTube Bakunovsky's process, there's a little video where they'll show you like an animation of what this might look like. All right, so the tour continues, and soon the DHC, the Director of Hatcheries and Conditioning, who is an alpha, he's a big deal, he's very important. He's joined by our first minor character, Henry Foster. He is an alpha male who works at the center. He takes them to the bottling room. Here, the embryos are added to bottles with blood surrogates. So essentially, think of a beaker that looks all red. It's a womb. It's an artificial womb that they're going to sit on for the next however many meters of this assembly line. Here in the bottling room, the lower castes are put through a series of treatments that stunts their growth. So they might be subjected to a really high temperature that's going to cause their growth to stunt, or they might be shaken, or they might have alcohol added to their bottle. All of these different things are going to affect that developing embryo or fetus. One element of the conditioning, so we read a little bit about conditioning with Skinner and Pavlov, but this conditioning is, as they do here, is they can help people be predetermined what they will like in their life. So if you have someone that needs to be okay working in Antarctica and working on, the telephone wires outside in Antarctica, they're going to subject that bottle to extremely cold temperatures so it gets used to it in the quote unquote womb. It also says during this time that 70% of females are sterilized because there is no reason that women need to have babies the old fashioned way as we know it. They sterilize 70% of females because they can then take the ovaries just from those 30% and not have to worry about people being born the old fashioned way. Oop, jumped a little too far ahead. All right. In the final few pages of chapter 1, we meet one of our first main characters. The group approaches a strikingly pretty nurse named Lenina Crown. Henry speaks to her, and it is clear that they are somehow involved with one another. The group moves on to see more of the center, and they continue. So, the purpose of chapter 1, we are meant to be the students. The director giving the tour is to help readers better understand how this society operates. We meet 3 characters: the director, the alpha male that runs the center, Henry Foster, the alpha male that is employed there, and Lenina Crown, who is a beautiful beta nurse. Now, you might be thinking, well, why is an alpha male with a beta female? In this time when Huxley wrote the book in the 1930s, I would say that there was still a little bit of social hierarchy. Glass ceiling hadn't been broken through yet. So there are actually no females in this society that are allowed to be alphas. The highest caste that a female can be is a beta. So Lenina would be kind of the tip top of females. All right, significant quotes we can skip over. Some things that I might just mention because they stood out to me. Notice the motto of this world state: community, identity, stability. Freedom is not one of the mottos, which is a motto of our country. One of the mottos that we're founded on is liberty and freedom. People are manufactured. Make sure that you understand that. Personal freedom, self-determination, non-existent. People are mass produced. And notice that there is not a lot of compassion for the workers, given the fact that they're making other human beings. There seems to be a lack of humanity, which is ironic. All right, so that's chapter 1. Going on to chapter 2, because I'm going to ask you guys to look at both chapter 1 and 2. We continue on in our tour of the Central London Hatchery and Conditioning. You don't have to do this. All right. So chapter 2 continues with our tour, and the director of hatcheries and conditionings brings the students now to the infant nurseries. So once they travel through on their bottle, their artificial womb long enough, eventually they're quote unquote born. So they reach the height of their development, and then they're brought to the infant nurseries. This is where more conditioning happens. They make a point to tell us that babies are conditioned to hate books and flowers because they arrange these beautiful flowers and all of these really colorful picture books out on the floor for these children. And when the children are brought in, they said they're brought in on dumbwaiters. So think about like the things that people at hotels push when they bring you room service. So basically, the babies are just all like they're stacked up on like an AV cart, if you will. And so when the babies crawl over to them, they play this really loud siren and they electrocute the floor so that the babies get shocked. This, just like the conditioning you read about in the web quest, helps to make them so that they are going to hate flowers and that they're going to hate books. You might be wondering what's the reasoning behind this? Well, the reasoning behind this is consumerism. That's one of the other backbones of this society. If people are spending their time isolated and alone reading books, that's trying to improve themselves and improve their knowledge. And it's also something that you do alone. So you're not giving back to society, you're not consuming, you're not mass producing or mass consuming anything. And so they don't want you to like books. Flowers, well, it's the same thing. To be out in nature, nature, most of the time it should be nature's free to go on a walk to appreciate the forest or a tree or a flower. It doesn't cost anything, and this society is all about consumerism. The other thing that they mention in this chapter is hypnopaedia, another conditioning method in which they sleep teach. Now, for those of you that think this will work, this doesn't actually work. So you can't just play the audiobook for Brave New World while you sleep and expect to wake up knowing the whole thing. But anyway, they spend some time in this chapter talking about hypnopaedia and how they teach morals. So kids will go to sleep, and if they want you to think that you as an alpha are the most important caste and you shouldn't play with those filthy, stupid epsilon children, they will play that motto on repeat as you sleep so that it just becomes ingrained in you. You don't have to think about it. You just know I am an alpha and I am better. Epsilons are dirty and stinky and stupid. And that just becomes a part of your overall belief system. So that's how they use hypnopaedia to teach morals. All right, we don't need to do those significant quotes. All right, and then again brings us to chapter 3, and we don't need to get there yet. So I'm going to post this little video for you guys with our reading schedule. I will also post by the end of the day your little hero's journey assignment, and I will post you the links for our first 2 audiobooks. Okay, so have fun, try to enjoy this book. It can be hard to begin with, but once it picks up, I promise it's worthwhile.